and the combating of existential threats such as climate change. Our vision is a world where peace is the norm and war is the exception. In the wake of the Quad Summit in Tokyo and the steady operationalization of the AUKUS military pact, Australia's role in the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy is becoming ever more important. It appears that Australia has become or is becoming a frontline state in Washington's strategy to counter or even contain China. On the other hand, Beijing seems to be in no mood to pull back on the harsh economic sanctions and measures it has taken against Australia. Are U.S. Australia ties becoming hostage to the single issue of countering China? Are Australia-China relations at a point of no return? How will the Australian elections that just concluded with the new Prime Minister in Canberra change Canberra's preferences abroad? I am Sarang Shidore. I'm Director of Studies at the Quincy Institute, welcoming you to this webinar. And along with me, joining me today, we have an excellent panel of three eminent experts from Australia to talk to us about all these questions. So I'm going to start by introducing them one by one. I'm going to start with Sam Roggeveen. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you.
Sam is director of the Lowy Institute's International Security Program. Before joining the Lowy Institute, he was a senior strategic analyst in Australia's peak intelligence agency, the Office of National Assessments. Sam is widely published on Australian foreign and defense policy and strategic trends in Asia. He's a regular commentator on the Lowy Institute's digital magazine, The Interpreter, of which he was the founding editor from 2007 to 2014. Sam also has a long-standing interest in politics and political philosophy, and in 2019, he wrote Our Very Own Brexit, Australia's Hollow Politics and Where It Could Lead Us, about the hollowing out of Western democracy and its implications for Australia. Sam also serves as editor of the Lowy Institute's flagship publication, the Lowy Institute Papers. Hugh White, welcome to the event, Hugh.
Nice to be with you, Sarang.
Is Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies at the Australian National University in Canberra. He spent much of his career in the Australian government, including as International Relations Advisor to Prime Minister Bob Hawke and Deputy Secretary for Strategy in the Department of Defense. He was a founding editor of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and from 2004 to 2011, he was head of ANU's Strategic and Defense Studies Center. His major publications, and he has quite a few, but the two I want to mention for today's event are The China Choice, Why America Should Share Power, that was published in 2012. And most recently, he has written a book called How to Defend Australia, written in 2019. That takes us to our third panelist, who's Beck Strating. Welcome to the webinar, Beck.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Beck Strating is the director of Trobe Asia and an associate professor in politics and international relations in the Department of Politics, Media and Philosophy at La Trobe University, Melbourne. Her research focuses on maritime disputes in Asia and Australian foreign and defense policy. Her most recent monograph is titled, and she has a number of them, her most recent one is titled Defending the Maritime Rules-Based Order in 2020. That's when it was published. In 2019, she was awarded an Asian Studies Visiting Fellowship to research at the East-West Center. She has also been affiliated with the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, in Georgetown University, and the Perth U.S. Asia Center. So with these introductions done, let's get right to it. And I'm going to start with you, Beck, as the first person here. And I'm going to actually talk about the election, because we just had a really important and pivotal election in Australia after nearly 10 years of the Liberal National coalition in power. I should explain to some of our American friends that the Liberal Party in Australia is a conservative party politically. So the Liberal National Coalition was defeated. We have a Labour government. I believe they have a majority of their own. And it's been an interesting change with the new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. So I just want to get from you, Beck, a sort of a bird's eye view to start off our event today on how do you think Prime Minister Albanese's foreign policy will be different, and how will it be similar to Prime Minister Morrison? Sort of a synopsis, sort of a quick survey of it, if you could.
No worries. And unless the numbers have changed overnight, I think we're still waiting to see whether Labor's going to get to the majority. But I'm not sure it quite matters either way for thinking about foreign policy and national security. And judging from the campaign, I don't think this Labor government is going to stray too far from the Morrison government's approach to the United States. There's a strong support for the Quad. That was one of the first things that Albanese did. I think he was 3 hours as Prime Minister, and he was on a plane to Tokyo with the new Foreign Minister, Penny Wong. But what I think the Labor government will do is try to emphasise more the importance of regional relationships, particularly in the Pacific and in Southeast Asia. And the big change is the new government's commitment to climate action. And this is something that the United States has been, putting some pressure on the previous Morrison government. And I think that this is something that the new Labor government is trying to sort of inject into its approach in the Quad meetings, for example. And this is certainly, it's important domestically as well, because if it is a minority government, and even if it's not in the Senate, the new government will have to negotiate with a much more powerful Greens party, which has been advocating for climate change, as well as this new wave of so-called teal independents, who are a group of individuals who have been elected on the basis of climate action and a range of other issues, including integrity and equality for women. So the big focus of the campaign, though, was not so much US. There's kind of, they're in lockstep on a lot of the US alliance stuff. It's really about how to deal with China. And again, there's not a huge amount of difference. The part of Labor's issue is that they've been cast as being soft on national security. So in an attempt to kind of mitigate that narrative or to neutralise that narrative, the Labor government did try to steer quite closely to the coalition. And the coalition itself, I think, started off trying to make it a bit of a khaki election. But of course, the Solomon Islands and China pact can't control events. And that was really, I think, instrumental. It was an important moment in the campaign. And what that allowed was the Labor Party to really emphasise other elements of statecraft aside from military. They introduced a Pacific policy, which wasn't just about, what kit are we going to buy, but it was about what can we do in terms of development, in terms of diplomacy, in terms of overseas aid, in order to improve our soft power, in order to improve our capacity to influence and persuade in the region. So and some of the tweets that Sam sent out over the weekend might mean that he might disagree with me on this, and I'm interested to hear what he has to say. But I don't see a Labor government that's going to move too far away from AUKUS or from the Quad. But I'd be interested to hear what other panelists have to say.
Well, you covered a lot of ground there. Solomon Islands, China, United States, the region, climate change, and AUKUS, of course. We are going to get into all of that in the next hour. So I'm going to, all of this that you just talked about speaks to foreign policy and how Australia views the strategic landscape in its neighborhood, in its continent, next door continent, Asia, and abroad, in the whole world in general. And that gets me to the next question, which is for Hugh. I want to sort of get to understand better your point of view on what you see as Australia's primary strategic threats when you survey the landscape and you look ahead for about maybe 15 or 20 years. How would you rank Australia's strategic threats, the primary ones, and perhaps you could also mention a couple of secondary ones?
Well, thanks, Sarang, and it's really a great pleasure to be with you and to be with my fellow panelists here today. Look, I think in order to understand what's happening in Australian foreign policy and to understand the choices Australia faces as we try to work our alliance with the United States and manage our relationship with China, it's very important to understand that along with New Zealand, Australia occupies a very unusual position in the Western Pacific. You know, the nation we are today, complex and multicultural as we are, is nonetheless derived very directly from the European, the British settlement of Australia in 1788. And ever since that moment, Australia has depended on its security and has seen itself as depending on its security, for its security on the domination of the Western Pacific by an Anglo-Saxon power. First it was Britain, roughly speaking, from 1788 until, pick a date, the fall of Singapore, 1942. Since then, it's been the United States. The really significant factor for Australia today is that as China's power grows, we have to imagine a future for ourselves in an age in which the United States is no longer going to be the dominant power. And perhaps the big difference between me and most other participants in the debate in Australia, and for that matter in the United States, is that I do see the rise of China economically as making it very difficult for the United States to sustain the kind of primacy upon which Australia has always depended. And so as we confront a more ambitious, a more aggressive China and a much more powerful China on the one hand, and look at what relationship we have with the United States' efforts to preserve its position in Asia on the other, we do face arguably the biggest foreign policy challenge in our history. And this, we shouldn't be surprised that this is a very difficult challenge for Australia, but we should, I think, be struck, and goes back to the point that Beck made, that there's almost no political disputation about this in Australia. And since we wake up to the fact that China's power is rising and its ambitions are rising as swiftly as they are, and we didn't wake up to that until very late, really about 2017, the instinct in Australia on both sides of politics has been to cling more and more tightly to the United States, to rely more and more on the United States to solve our China problem for us, because we don't want to live in a region dominated by China. Obviously, we don't want to fall under China's shadow. So we're clinging to the United States, which in a sense is what we've always done in the past. And the question for us really is that going to work? Now, both Labor and Coalition, the new government as much as the old government, are very devoted to the proposition that it will. I don't think it's that simple. I think we have to be much more careful about presuming that the United States primacy can do for us in future what it's done for us in the past. One way of framing this is people often see that Australia faces a choice between our economics on the one hand and our security on the other. Our economics, because China is and will probably continue to be our biggest trading partner by far. We have never been as reliant on one market for our exports as we are on China today, and except when we were part of the British imperial preference system back in the 19th and early 20th century. So that really does look like our economic future. And some people sometimes say we have to decide about our economic future with China or our security future with America. But I don't think it's that simple, because I don't think in the end we're going to be able to rely on the United States to provide us with the security we need in an Asia in which America confronts a rival as powerful and determined as China is today. And my position on where we are at the moment is that Labor has taken power without a viable alternative approach to the one that's been taken by its Conservative predecessors under Scott Morrison, and which has caused a big rupture in our relations with China, and has been a background to things like the AUKUS agreement with the United States.
Right. In fact, that's exactly what I wanted to ask Sam about, because Hugh just painted a pretty clear picture on the rise of China, and he also spoke about the US being perhaps not as much on the front on taking on China as people assume. But coming to AUKUS, which is sort of the flagship announcement of last year, it is the sort of alliance, jewel in the crown, if you will, this pact of building 6 or 8 submarines, nuclear-powered submarines that will replace the original contract, which were the French diesel-electric submarines. And these are to be built with the U.S., U.K., and Australia all together. But it's not just about submarines. It's about technologies of different kinds, including AI, hypersonics, quantum mechanics, and so forth. So it's a very broad-ranging, technology-centric military and defense pact. So I wanted to sort of ask you, Sam, you wrote a very interesting article last year that caught my eye, and it was titled, Changing My Mind About AUKUS. And I think it got a lot of attention here in the US. And in that article, you were candid and you said that you were looking back at AUKUS and you were starting to think about it more pessimistically. You laid out a number of reasons why. One quote of yours I'm going to repeat when you were talking about Australia as an ally with the US with those submarines. And you said that when it comes down to it, saying no to an ally when having the means to say yes is hard. You were talking about how creation of capabilities creates certain kinds of obligations, certain structures, if you will, that are not easy to escape. So speak to that article and beyond, since it's been a few months since you wrote it, and tell us what sort of capabilities AUKUS is going to bring to bear, and what sort of grand strategy is it compatible with for Australia and the alliance?
Thank you, Sarang. Well, I think maybe the way to start is to actually say that my skepticism about the AUKUS, the submarine portion of the AUKUS agreement, has deepened since I wrote that article, and even just over the last few months. And that's not so much on the question of the military strategy that sits behind it, which I'll talk about in a moment. It's more to do with delivering this project on time. So the standard assumption here is that we will get the first of these 8 nuclear-powered submarines in 2038. The previous Defence Minister, Peter Dutton, seemed to hint that we could get them a couple of years earlier than that. Everything I've heard from people who work closely in defence industry here in Australia suggests that even 2038 is pretty optimistic, and that we should be thinking in terms of something like 2045, which is really, even 2038 is well beyond the kind of time frame that we really need to replace the capability that we have now, never mind waiting to 2045. So it seems to me there is a prospect over the medium term here. I don't think this agreement will be cancelled in short order, or even in the medium term, but there is a prospect here that it could be sort of pushed into kicked into the long grass, as golfers would say, simply because we will need an interim capability. And then over time, as we get more news about this thing blowing out in terms of budget, in terms of timeline, then the interim capability will start to become the actual capability. And the AUKUS submarine, might get pushed out to what Australians sometimes call the never never. So that I'm extremely pessimistic about AUKUS from purely a project management perspective and the sheer scale of the project. On the strategic question, it seems to me the reason I'm against AUKUS is because it supports a strategy which is not viable for Australia and which is unnecessarily provocative and could be escalatory in a crisis. So Hugh has talked already about the fact that both sides of politics, their answer to the rise of China is basically to connect more strongly to the alliance. Well, AUKUS and the submarine deal in particular is, the apotheosis of that trend. I mean, essentially, we're building a force structure that will help us achieve American strategic objectives to hem the Chinese Navy in close to its shores. And that, to me, seems unnecessarily provocative and escalatory towards China, when Australia could easily defend itself, maintain a deterrent without, causing that kind of provocation. And we could do it at much less cost. So it seems to me this is an unnecessarily provocative strategy that's being pursued primarily to reinforce the alliance, when as Hugh has been arguing, over the long term, we ought to be thinking about how Australia defends itself in almost a post-alliance context.
Right. So this is very interesting because, Australian grand strategy started out with forward defense in the 50s and 60s. And that was an offensive, sort of a containment-oriented strategy, then sort of fell back on defense of Australia, which was a more defensive strategy in the 70s. And now we seem to be going back into, along with the United States, into a more offensive mode. And this is, of course, has to do with China. So I'm going to actually turn back to Hugh here, and I'm going to try and understand what you think about the fact that the argument that you made that China is rising and the United States is sort of pulling back, or its commitment is not guaranteed. But, in the last year and a half, and indeed for some years, and this continues with the current administration here in Washington with President Biden, you are seeing a doubling down on the strategy to contain or confront China. You're seeing all sorts of course, rhetorical statements. We had a statement on Taiwan. It's not the first one, incidentally, that came out yesterday from President Biden on defense of Taiwan. We have also had, of course, AUKUS. We have had Quad ramping up with leaders summits and lots of things being announced. We are seeing substantially increased focus in Congress on acts in terms of strategic competition on technology. Tariffs, obviously, from President Trump, they have been retained by this administration. So what I'm trying to get at here is that the US doesn't seem to be pulling back, does it? And so your sense of, if you will, pessimism, if you will, in quotes, of the US sort of retrenching from Asia, how would you look at all these points I just laid out and square that with your argument?
Yeah, so thanks, Sarang, really key question. Look, I wouldn't put the pessimism in quotes. I'm pessimistic. And an important part of that is that nothing that I'm about to say suggests that I would not myself prefer the United States to remain the primary power in East Asia. That's what would work best for Australia. But I am pessimistic that that's going to happen. And I'm pessimistic notwithstanding all of the points you make, which are, of course, quite correct, because of what seem to me to be the underlying fundamentals of the situation. This might seem a bit simplistic, but in the end, the deep foundation of national power is national wealth. The United States has been the most powerful country in the world since the late 19th century because it's been the wealthiest country in the world since the late 19th century. And one of the things that we're all finding it really hard to get our heads around is the fact that that's not true anymore. The Australian government in January issued some estimates. This is the old Conservative government, or like the Labor government, radically pro-American. But their latest estimate is that in PPP terms, which are the terms that really matter, today China's economy is 19% of global GDP and America's is 16%. And the estimate is that in 2035, which is the day after tomorrow in strategic terms, China's economy will be 24% of global GDP and America's will be 14%. Now, with that shift in the distribution of wealth and power, the idea that the United States can preserve a position of dominance in the Western Pacific, which it and its British predecessors acquired when their economies were immeasurably more powerful than those of any East Asian power, seems to me to be, so to speak, I'm very hesitant to use the phrase the laws of history, but it seems to me to defy, you could say, the tides of history. And then more specifically, it does seem to me that there's been a lot of talk in Washington about confronting China, but talk is cheap. What's important is what do you actually do? And many of the things you mention seem to me to be good examples of the sorts of things you talk about doing when you're not actually doing very much. And I mean, take AUKUS as an example. AUKUS is not just a very big story in Australia, it's a very big story in the United States. It's what people in Washington talk about when they talk about what America's doing to confront China. Well, the fact is, as Sam said, AUKUS actually at the moment is just a press release. There isn't any, vast structure behind it. It's just an idea. The cooperation on everything other than submarines is really just more, and I think actually not very much more, of a whole lot of stuff which has been going on forever. And it's very unclear that that really contributes in concrete terms to the enhancement of US military capabilities in Asia to enhance deterrence of China. And on the submarine specifically, well, Sam said it. Even if the first submarine is delivered by 2038, and like him, I'm very skeptical about that. The fact is that one submarine is not a capability. For Australia, 6 submarines is a minimum capability. That's why we have 6 now. We won't have 6 submarines until well into the 2050s, even if the first one's delivered in 2038. Excuse me, you know, the strategic contest between the United States and China as to which of them is going to be the dominant power in the Western Pacific will be over long before Australia has a viable nuclear-powered submarine capability. And what strikes me is that what we need to see in Washington, if we look at the scale of the challenge that China poses, what we need to see from Washington is not, for example, the economic agreement that President Biden was marketing in his East Asian visit, for example. But we need a really radical enhancement of America's willingness to engage economically in East Asia, which would have to include market access, which is precisely what America walked away from when they abandoned the TPP. We would have to see a radical expansion in US military capability. I mean, what we've seen in the balance of military capabilities is that 20 years ago, the balance was like that. Now the balance is like that, or even like that. For America to get back to a position where it can persuasively deter China, it would have to massively invest in military capability in the Western Pacific. And that is not happening. So despite all the talk, my pessimism about the future of the US position in Asia is simply based on the fact that we have in the United States a big rhetorical commitment to effectively confronting and containing China in the Western Pacific, but nothing resembling the kind of action that would have to be required. And if you really want to measure that, draw the contrast between what the United States has done in relation to China in the now 5 years since the 2017 National Security Strategy identified China as a first-order strategic rival, and what the United States did in the first 5 years of the Cold War, the first 5 years after the declaration of the sort of, you know, confrontation containment with the Soviet Union. It built NATO. It built the entire alliance posture in the Western Pacific. It massively increased America's military deployments in Europe and Asia. It fought the Korean War, and of course it had a massive increase in America's military nuclear capability. We just don't see anything like the scale of national effort that will be required by the United States to effectively confront and contain a country as powerful as China in China's own backyard over the last 5 years. And frankly, nothing I see coming out of Washington suggests that there's going to be any significant change about that. And that's dangerous, because for a country like Australia, what we see is a United States which talks up its rivalry with China, but does nothing sufficient to win it. And that to us is the worst of both outcomes.
Sarang, just quickly, another way to say what Hugh is saying is that what we've seen from the United States, your list is a list of cheap signals. What you want to see are costly signals from the United States. If you really wanted to believe that it was committed to maintaining a primacy in Asia, you want to see costly signals. AUKUS is not a costly signal for the United States. In fact, it's a very cheap one, because as I said in the article you mentioned, what the United States was effectively offered was a massive arms deal by the Morrison government. We effectively said to them, you know what, we are going to spend tens of billions of dollars in your arms industry, and we are going to reinforce your own Indo-Pacific naval fleet with an additional 8 submarines. What's not to like for the United States about that deal? It costs the US nothing, and it risks nothing. Even if the deal falls through in future, you know, what's the long-term harm done? So we're not seeing the costly signals.
Great points there, and I want to turn to Beck now, and I'm trying to get deeper into this. There's no question that what Hugh said about the US not doing the sorts of things we saw in the 50s is true and very interesting. But then the United States and Asia has much more capable allies today. Japan, South Korea, Philippines and Thailand much less so, but all of these countries are economically much better off than they were in the 50s. And not only that, the US is putting together new mini-laterals in the region, a group like the Quad, for example, or encouraging trilaterals between South Korea, Japan, and the United States. And that involves these massive barriers between South Korea and Japan that exist, trying to lower those and getting those two countries to work together in a defense security sense. And these are both very capable countries today in terms of military potential and capacity. So two aspects to this. One is alliances and partnerships, and India has been roped in some fashion with the Malabar exercise, these exercises are very specifically anti-submarine warfare, interdiction, things that look very China specific in a contingency, right? So one aspect is the hard aspect of these mini-laterals. Do you think that compensates or is going to compensate for the deficits that Hugh mentioned and the cost question that Sam mentioned? And second, the normative aspect of, for example, the Quad. I mean, there's so much about a group of democracies countering autocracy. This normative turn, how does it have legs? Does it go part of the way in compensating for the lack of, or let's say the different balance of hard power that we have today in Asia?
Yeah, they're two really important questions. So on the first part of that, around the kind of the hard power aspects of these mini-laterals, I mean, I think we've seen with the response to Ukraine that some of these groupings are operating at a kind of quite superficial level. Like, this is about countering China, or maybe you could say it's about containing China. But when there comes a point of tension in the views or the strategic cultures within these states, that kind of consensus can break down pretty quickly. And that's what my concern is that right now the Quad makes sense, and these four countries are together, and they can, there's some interesting moves that are being made in, the maritime domain awareness front, and with vaccines and things like that. But when it comes to the crunch, are these countries going to stick together? I think that's the crucial question. The other one, of course, is, we talk about the Indo-Pacific region. The Indo-Pacific's made up of, small and middle powers, a lot of island states, a lot of developing states. These are exclusionary. This is about the fact that these countries no longer have a lot of power in multilateral institutions. I think that's more of the problem. And the mini-lateral provide, already quite powerful regional powers the opportunity to try to continue to set the agenda in ways that I think are actually pushing out states that are really important to us in the region. It's important for us that we have strong, genuine, positive relations with states in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, and in Southeast Asia. And so I think that's something that, particularly, well, all of the Quad states need to really keep in mind. And on the second point about the kind of normative elements, I mean, it's interesting to me that at times the Quad is about bringing together maritime democracies, but at other times it's not about democracies. It's about, it's about shared interests, and it's about, security and providing positive good to the region. And I'm kind of like, well, you can't have it both ways. I mean, I find the democracy stuff quite hollow for two reasons. The first is carving the world into these binary categories doesn't work in a region where most of the states that we need to try and get along with are not, full democracies. According to the Economic Intelligence Unit latest democracy survey, there's only 4 full democratic states in the Indo-Pacific. And we need to get along with hybrid regimes. We need to get along with competitive authoritarian regimes. We need to get along with authoritarian regimes. Like Australia and the United States is really trying to engage with Vietnam, particularly on the maritime and the South China Sea issues. Now, Vietnam's nowhere near being a democracy. So the framing to me doesn't make sense. And the second key issue I have with this is that it masks masks democratic decline within the Quad states themselves. Particularly the United States, that's been downgraded as a kind of flawed democracy. And Australia, we really don't want to think about US domestic politics and what it means in the long term for the US alliance. I mean, that's just, we lack creativity and we lack strategic imagination when it comes to thinking about the future of US politics and what that means for AUKUS and all the rest of it. India, this is a country that is really struggling when it comes to its democratic credentials under the BJP Modi government. Australia is desperately trying to increase its ties with India in the hope that it will counter China, turning a blind eye to things like democratic credentials, quality of democracy, civil liberties, the rest of it. In Australia itself, we are going backwards on some of these metrics. And what the Morrison government's tendency to do, and even before the Morrison government, was to mirror some of these authoritarian states that we're afraid of by, trying to intimidate the press, trying to intimidate whistleblowers by introducing national security legislation that actually also restricts things like transparency and civil liberties. And while I don't want to press the point too much in the Australian context, I just would like to point out that that the Quad states themselves as a coalition are experiencing some of the more global trends where democracy is in fact going backwards rather than moving forwards.
Absolutely. Some really excellent points on all the Quad members there. I think we are seeing that very much true for them. And Australia is possibly where the institutions are the strongest in many ways. But I want to get to this with Sam, because I know that you're interested in this space particularly. You wrote a book about it. You write about it, periodically. So just stepping back and addressing Beck's point about the decline of democracy, looking at Australia, there are two aspects one can look at. One is the fact that you have these parties that are winning and the opposition party concedes. So that's a good thing. That's democratic. And the second thing is that you do have apparently certain debates on foreign policy, like climate change, which we are going to get to in a bit more. So but you're not sanguine about this, right? So you have some observations. So share with us, where do you see Australian democracy going, especially with respect to foreign policy?
I'm actually fairly optimistic on that question, in the sense that my major argument has been not so much about the quality of democracy being in decline, but of one core element of our democracy, and in fact every Western democracy, going into decline, and that is its major political parties. And so we have seen the strongest evidence yet at this election that of major party decline, which, as I said, is happening around the West and has had a lot of unpredictable and unusual consequences. I would count Brexit as being one of those. The rise of right-wing populism in Europe is another. Trump, I would argue, was essentially a third party or an independent president in the United States in Republican guise. So in Australia's case, we're now seeing the clearest evidence yet that the two major parties are in decline. The Labor Party now is has formed or is able to form government, and yet its primary vote, that is the number of people who put the Labor Party first, is at record lows. And as someone said the other day, in any other circumstances, the fact that Labor's primary vote is down near 32% would be called an existential crisis for the Labor Party. But as it is, they've won the election comfortably. The voting system disguises the fact that we are moving away from this two-party system. We don't have, I think, in any real sense, a two-party system anymore. But just to get to the optimism part of it, what it does open up, it makes Parliament more important. Because we now have a sizable crossbench, because governments are likely to have razor-thin majorities in the future, or even be minority governments. I think that's now going to be the standard for Australia, that empowers Parliament, and particularly the lower house of Parliament, the House of Representatives, which has been, I think, has underperformed as a place of accountability and review in Australia. So I think we could do a lot better there. So in that sense, I'm optimistic. What hasn't yet happened in Australia, and what could happen, and here's where the pessimism comes in, is that because the hold of the major parties is now so weak, there is space there for a very talented, charismatic, and well-resourced independent to come in and essentially cause a Trump-like disruption to the Australian political system. Now, so far, those forces have come from the centre. They could also come from one of the fringes. That's still, I think, a distant danger in Australia. But as the grip of the two major parties on our politics weakens, I think it does open up that space.
Just to follow up on that, yeah, go ahead, Sam.
Oh, I realised I didn't touch on the foreign policy aspect of the question. Right. Look, the key point there is that the American alliance is in the DNA of both of our major parties. They both claim that they are the party that originated the alliance. So the Labor Party during the Second World War turned from the United Kingdom to the United States, and then post-war, the Liberal Party actually inaugurated the ANZUS alliance. So they both have it in their DNA. Again, as the grip of the two major parties weakens on Australian politics, I can also see that aspect of our political culture slipping.
Right. So I want to get to some of this and link it with. I think, Beck, you mentioned earlier that you don't think there's going to be a big difference with Labor in charge on issues like AUKUS, on the alliance focus on countering China and the way it's doing that with other countries in the region, U.S. allies and so forth. Why do you think that is the case? So here, we are not seeing that sort of a democratic debate, it seems to me.
Well, I think there's been, as Sam was saying before, particularly issues of the US alliance are kind of ingrained in the DNA of both parties. And in some ways, this election campaign was positive because it did actually bring national security issues and foreign policy issues into the election campaign. And that doesn't always happen in Australia. There's kind of this assumed bipartisanship on issues of national security, and even a kind of assumption that that's a positive thing, when actually I think that in a healthy democracy, we should have discussions and debates. I mean, even sitting here and listening to Hugh and Sam talk about the nuclear-powered submarines, I don't think that we've had a real conversation anywhere about what these submarines are supposed to do. And how are the citizens supposed to understand what the purpose of these submarines are for, when most of our national security community talk in jargon and aren't really communicating with citizens, but communicating between themselves. I mean, a recent ASPI report says that $171 billion might be sunk into these submarines. That is a huge amount of money. And yet in the public, we're not really talking about, well, what do we want them to do? Are we trying to deter China? What about the 10 million square kilometre economic exclusive zone that Australia claims around our own coast? Are they going to help with that? I mean, we're not really having that discussion. And I mean, as I said in my opening comments, part of the challenge is that coalition has wedged Labor on issues of national security, and Labor is very conscious of that in the past they've been painted as weak. And if Sam is right, and we're going to be moving away from two-party system, then we need a Greens party that's going to pay more attention to national security, because their defence policy was pretty thin, and we need independents to be paying attention to it too. I think only Zoe Daniel produced anything that sort of looked like a coherent foreign policy or statement on national security. These teal independents, the teal wave, is based on three issues: climate, integrity, and women. They're not talking about national security, but maybe they should be.
Indeed, perhaps they should be. And I want to sort of get to some audience questions now because we are starting to see them in. And please, those who are watching this, drop your questions in the Q&A box if you haven't already. We have one question here that I wanted to get to, which is from John Ekstrom. And he talks about Timor-Leste. And he talks about how we should be, Australia, United States alliance as well as partners, should be doing more in terms of investing in these countries, these sort of Australia's neighbors, smaller island states. And that's, of course, come up very recently in a big way here with the Solomon Islands. In the Solomon Islands, the way it has struck a deal with China, and that's raised a lot of consternation here with, with top officials flying down there to try and persuade them not to go for this deal and so forth. So, Hugh, I wanted to get to you. And in your book, How to Defend Australia, you talk about these island neighbors. And you do say that these countries, it's in Australia's national interest and presumably the alliances to have friendly, stable governments in these smaller countries like Solomon Islands, Kiribati, and so forth. What does that mean in the context of the current developments? The fact that China is striking these deals, first of all, is that a security question? Secondly, if it is, does that concern you based on what you have argued in the past?
Look, Sarang, I think this is a very interesting issue. Sam talked about the U.S. alliance being in Australia's, in both parties' DNA, and that's certainly true. But even deeper in our DNA is the idea that we Australia want to exclude any potentially hostile power from that band of small islands that stretches across our northern approaches. And this goes all the way back to the mid-19th century. Back in the mid-19th century, Australian fledgling statesmen were talking about establishing a Monroe Doctrine of the South Pacific. And that Monroe model, keeping potentially hostile major powers from far away out of our immediate neighbourhood. So the idea that we see China moving into these islands, seeking a position of greater influence, and not just economic influence, but also strategic or security participation, does deeply worry us. And we saw this, as has been mentioned, during the election campaign with the Solomon Islands China deal that you mentioned. The big question for us is, how should we respond? Our traditional response has been very Monroe Doctrine-ish. That is, we just need to do whatever it takes to keep these countries free of influence of a country like China. I think we need to pause and reflect on that, because I think we need to ask ourselves, is it practical for Australia or for the United States to presuppose that we can prevent these countries establishing their own way of dealing with a country as powerful and important to them as China is? Beck made the really important point before talking about the Quad, that the more that we and the United States and other Quad members frame what's happening in Asia as Australia and its Quad partners trying to contain China and prevent China's influence in Asia and the Western Pacific spreading, the more we're going to be, so to speak, depriving the smaller states of their capacity to make their own choices about these things. And of course, that's actually failed. I mean, one of the big stories about America's failure to successfully respond to China's challenge in the Western Pacific has been what seems to me to be its complete failure to make any progress in Southeast Asia. I mean, Southeast Asia just does not buy the Quad model. It doesn't buy the Indo-Pacific as it's conceived in Washington, and for that matter in Canberra. And I think the same is happening in the Southwest Pacific. So my argument is that we need to be more realistic about how we manage our relation with these states. Australia has failed in the decades since they became independent countries in their own right to build the kind of relationship that will allow us to manage our interests there effectively when we're facing serious competition. So I absolutely agree that we need to be doing a lot more in those small island neighbours, including Timor-Leste, but all the others as well. But we also need to be, but it's a big mistake for us to try and do that on the basis that we're just going to try and keep the Chinese out, because that's just not going to work. Now, what does that mean militarily? I think it's perfectly straightforward. Again, it goes back to a point that Beck raised, that we don't have anything like a sophisticated national debate on what Australia's armed forces should really be trying to do and how they can best do it. I do think we could build a more independent defence posture for Australia. An important part of that would be the capacity, if it comes to a war, to neutralise adversary forces like Chinese forces based in those islands to our north. I don't think operationally that's a terribly demanding thing to do. We have some important aspects of the operational and geographical thing on our side there. But I think what we should be doing is preparing ourselves militarily to manage an intrusion into those island states in war, but building a much more flexible and open and frankly less paranoid approach to managing Chinese engagement in that part of the world in peacetime.
Very interesting that this idea of differentiated strategy, that you have sort of keep your powder dry, but you don't brandish it and use coercive tactics to try and get these islands to line up with the United States and Australia. So Sam, would you agree with that? And how would you counsel the US in this? Australia knows this region better than Washington does.
I have many things to say, but I see that Beck has been desperately trying to get your attention, Sarang. So
right. Sorry, I didn't see that. My bad.
Sorry, thanks, Sam. I was trying to butt in. I just wanted to add a couple of things to what Hugh was saying, because Pacific, like in terms of the idea of the Indo-Pacific and this concept, is now taken as a given in Australia, which doesn't really correspond well with the views of some other countries. In Pacific, they have their own Blue Pacific concept, and it's a kind of alternative to the Indo-Pacific. And I know, you know, there's one book that's quite sort of famous on the Indo-Pacific that had about 2 pages on the Pacific. You know, this is a framework that is not politically or ideologically neutral, and yet we kind of present it like it is. And the other issue, going back to the original question about Timor-Leste, I mean, I've spent a lot of time thinking about Australia's relations with Timor, and the issue isn't that you know, we don't spend enough aid or anything like that. In fact, Australia, I believe, and Lowy does excellent work on this, in the Pacific is still the #1 aid donor. The issue is to do with the fact that we don't have a lot of respect for their agency. You know, Morrison comes out and talks about red lines, for example, in Solomon Islands, in the Solomon Island example. Now, what exactly the red line is a mystery, but also what we would do is a mystery. We overrate our capacity to influence our region and to provide, you know, alternatives that are persuasive. And you know, I don't think that these states want to choose. And Hugh White counselled Australia for many years that we won't be able to get away with that, and maybe these states won't be able to get away with that either. But for the moment, they're trying to leverage strategic competition, and that seems like a kind of rational choice to me.
Sarang,
yes,
I would just push back slightly on the tone of pessimism, I guess, that I'm getting from Hugh and Beck about Australia's potential to compete with China in the Pacific Islands region. We've got some big things in our favour. One is just proximity. So when a crisis hits, when there's trouble, it's easier for us to get to the Pacific Islands region than it is for China to do so. Second, we have a lot of history and some cultural links, sporting links as well that China doesn't have, will never have. We have the Pacific Island Worker Scheme, which is designed to create or develop a kind of remittance economy in the Pacific Islands region. That's an arrangement that China will never copy. It's impossible to imagine Pacific Island workers going to China for that kind of purpose. I also think that the other thing we have in our favour is, to use a term that Hugh likes a lot, that I got from him, there's an imbalance of resolve. The Pacific Islands matters more to us than it does to China. Of course, they're much bigger, But it's always going to be a secondary strategic theatre for China, not for us. It's always the primary strategic theatre. And then lastly, just to reinforce what Beck said, not only are we the biggest aid donor in the Pacific, we are by far the biggest. We have a big lead, and that's going to be very hard to reel in. And in fact, the research that my colleagues at Lowy have done over the last few years suggests that China's aid spending in the Pacific peaked a couple of years ago and has been flatlining ever since.
Very interesting. The South Pacific is also, of course, not just a theater of this new geopolitical competition, so to speak, but is also threatened by climate change. And indeed, Australia is threatened by climate change. If you look at the last 3 years, 500 Australians have died of natural disasters. At least a substantial component of that is due to the magnification of due to climate change. In the United States, we have had many natural disasters, just like Australia. We have had a pandemic. 1 million Americans have died in the pandemic. So I want to sort of turn to Hugh now and try and understand, because the classic defense analysis is heavy on military strategy, on invasions, on an adversary that's a state, sometimes non-state. But very rarely does it take into account these sorts of threats, which, if you know, the million Americans that have tragically died here, none of them was killed by a Chinese soldier or a Russian soldier. They were killed by a microbe. So how do you factor issue like climate change into your analysis? When you think of the strategic threat matrix, where would you put it today and going forward? And what sort of strategy should the alliance adopt?
Well, Sarang, really good question. I'm, as you'll have gathered, tend to the pessimistic side on things, including the pessimistic side as to where Australia's got to politically in our debates about these grand geostrategic questions that we've been discussing. But I'm going to allow myself a moment of optimism on the question of climate change, at least as we're dealing with it in Australia. We've had an extremely bitter, divisive and very unedifying debate about climate change in Australia over the last decade or 2 decades, really. And I do think that one of the things that came out of our election last weekend was a clear, not decisive perhaps, but a clear shift towards an acceptance that we really do need to do something about climate change. And Australia has been very slow on this. We've been very, very recalcitrant. And so I think, in a sense, in Australia, as I think elsewhere, the great political debates about climate change are past. And we now just have a massive technical and practical set of questions to address. But I'm tentatively optimistic that Australia is now going to be playing its part in that. So how we balance these things? Well, I think, one of the things we need to keep in mind is that there's no zero-sum trade-off between different kinds of security threats. We can face, as a society, as a global society, a truly existential threat from climate change on the one hand, and we do, and at the same time face a really serious threat to global order in the management of the shift in the distribution of wealth and power from the United States to China, and eventually, of course, not so eventually, to India, and we can mess both of those up in a big way. So I do think it's very important not to think that this is, we don't have to worry as much about US-China relations because we have to worry about climate change. We do have to worry about climate change, but the trajectory the United States and China are on at the moment is precisely the trajectory that the historians would expect to see in countries which are heading towards a war. I'm not one of those. I've read my Thucydides. I'm not one of those who thinks that war between the US and China is inevitable, but I do think it's a real risk, and it's a risk and a real risk of a nuclear war between them. And so I think what we need to do is to, in our political systems, in our analytical systems, acknowledge that we have to deal with the climate change issue as if it was really, really serious, because it is, and at the same time, deal with the risks that are posed to us from the management of US-China strategic rivalry. One of the things that really bewilders me about the debates I see in the United States and Australia about how we deal with China's power and ambition is the fact we don't pay nearly as much attention as we should to the fact that China is a nuclear power, and a war with China has a very good chance of being a nuclear war. And so when Joe Biden says, yes, we're going to defend Taiwan, This is the bloke who said he wouldn't defend Ukraine because it would be World War III. Well, what does he think a war with China over Taiwan would be like?
Absolutely. We at the Quincy Institute have very much seized of this question day in and day out. And I want to, we actually are almost out of time. So I want to give Beck Strating the last word here. And I want to see if I can bring out some optimism here on China, if possible. And that leads me back to climate change, because climate change is, in a declared sense, President Biden has said that he wants to cooperate with China on climate change. Do you see that realistic? And if so, what should the United States and Australia, now that it has a climate-friendly government, what should the alliance do in trying to make that a channel of engagement and de-escalation, even perhaps?
Well, that is a really interesting question. I should say that a friend of mine who is very much into horoscopes once told me that I was born on the day of buoyant optimism. And I know that's not really coming through today, but I have to agree both with Hugh's optimism around the climate picture in Australian politics. This has been a political issue for too long. In my view, it shouldn't be a political issue. This is an issue to do with science, and it should be very at the centre of what we're doing. But also the points that Sam raised about the Pacific. I mean, these are good points. Australia does have a lot of advantages in the region. What my concern is that we don't always learn the lessons, and that we are, without having a full and frank discussion and debate in Australia about these issues, that we won't learn some of the important lessons around foreign policy. But getting back to your point, yes, I think that climate change has been an issue with the Australia-US alliance. I mean, there are points in the US alliance, in the alliance, where these countries haven't always gotten along. They're not always in lockstep, which is sometimes sort of the caricature of the relationship. But climate is one of them. We might remember Obama blasting Abbott in 2014 at the G20 on climate issues. But I think there's a real question here about what a new government in Australia might do to try to advance climate cooperation. I think there would be a lot of skepticism in Australia about using climate change as a way to reset relations with China. I think partly because there'd be views that that's what Obama had tried and that had kind of failed. But I do think that that climate change is something that the Labor government seems to want to talk about in the US alliance, but also in these other mini-lateral and trilateral forums as well, which is, in my view, a very positive and optimistic sign.
Yes, so let's hang on to that sense of optimism, and but not forget the possibilities, the risks that we have, and that we have to work towards reducing. I want to thank all three of you for an excellent conversation. I think it's not so common that we get Australian voices here in Washington. It's getting more common, but especially voices that look in somewhat different ways at the Alliance and Asia. And I want to thank the audience. I just want to tell everyone that we are going to have a lot more of these events coming up. So within the next couple of weeks, expect a webinar on the U.S.-South Korea alliance, and also a webinar with some excellent panelists on U.S.-Asia economic engagement. What are the possibilities? What are the constraints? So tune in, follow our website. Thank you all very much.